Hi everyone and welcome to SAMA, a series which invites experts each week to talk about their area of expertise. This week we're delighted to have Lisa Hendrickson-Jack to talk about fertility, infertility and pregnancy. Lisa is a certified fertility awareness educator and a holistic reproductive health practitioner who teaches women to chart their menstrual cycles for natural birth control, conception and monitoring overall health. In her new book, this is your cue to hold up your book, Lisa.
Oh.
In her new book, The Fifth Vital Sign, Lisa debunks the myth that regular ovulation is only important when you want children. By recognizing the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, drawing heavily from the current scientific literature, Lisa presents an evidence-based approach to fertility awareness and menstrual cycle optimization. She hosts the Fertility Friday Podcast, which is a weekly radio show devoted to helping women connect to their fifth vital sign by uncovering the connection between the menstrual cycle health, fertility, and overall health. Lisa, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Now, the first question I'd love to ask you, what got you involved in fertility? What was the magnet that brought you in?
Well, in my case, I discovered fertility awareness at a pretty young age. I was about 18 or 19 years old.
Yes.
I joked that I was in my post-high school feminist phase. And so when I was in university, I was going to all these feminist talks, and we had a really awesome women's center on my campus, and they would bring in these really neat guest speakers that would talk about different things.
Yes.
And so there was an author that came to read an excerpt from her book, and I remember that she was just reading a part of it, and in that part, she mentioned that, she discovered that she wasn't fertile every single day of her cycle.
Oh, my goodness.
And she discovered that there was a way to prevent pregnancy without using hormones, just by tracking, the cervical mucus and the cervical position and the temperature. And so that was the first time I was ever exposed to that idea. And so basically I ran to the library and I bought Taking Charge of Your Fertility, which is the Fertility Awareness Bible for any woman who charts her cycles. That's usually where we, get our kind of gateway drug, if you will, to fertility awareness. And so I promptly started charting my cycles. But, looking back, it's kind of an interesting chain of events, because on my university campus, there was a group of women, and the group still meets. It's the Fertility Awareness Charting Circle in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And so, every month they would hold these sessions, and the women who led the sessions were trained in the method. So I started attending, I was charting, and then soon after I took a training program and began teaching. And so, one thing led to another, and here we are today. I'm still teaching. I've written this book. We were talking in the pre-chat, I've been podcasting for 5 years, because even though I've been immersed in this information in this field and personally doing the charting and the teaching for nearly 20 years, the average woman still doesn't know how her body and her fertility works. So the average woman doesn't know that she's not fertile every single day, and that it's possible to identify the short window of fertility in her cycle, whether she wants to achieve pregnancy and time it accurately, or whether she wants to avoid hormonal birth control but still have an effective method of birth control. That's basically what I'm always sharing about, because still we haven't really, not a whole lot has changed in terms of our education system and what we're taught in junior high.
Right, where we're taught pills and other things, we're not taught to listen to our bodies. And so you're saying that by tracking, we can see when our ideal times are for becoming pregnant, and times to avoid other activities if we don't want to be pregnant. Is that how?
Yes, absolutely. And what's interesting about it is that it's not that complicated. So of course, it's as complicated as we want it to be. I have an entire chapter about cervical mucus, and we could talk about all the different kinds. But when it comes down to the practicality of a woman just kind of charting her cycle and using this method, the three main fertile signs that we pay attention to are cervical fluid, basal body temperature, and cervical position. And so for any woman who's listening who doesn't really know about it, cervical fluid, it can look like clear, stretchy, raw egg whites. So when if you were to touch it and play with it, it would form a thread between your fingers. And so you produce that as you approach ovulation. It can also look like creamy white hand lotion. And so that is a central part of understanding how our fertility works, because cervical fluid can keep sperm alive for up to 5 days. And so the only time in your cycle that you can get pregnant from a scientific standpoint is when you have this fluid. The fluid changes your vaginal pH. It indicates that the cervix is open. And then that's the only time that sperm can actually get in there and reach the fallopian tubes as we approach ovulation. And so outside of that window, the cervix is closed. The sperm can't actually go through the cervix because the cervix is blocked with a thick mucus plug. And the vagina is acidic, so the environment is very bad for sperm. We kill the sperm. They don't live very long. And so I think it's for a lot of women, what we're taught, at least what I was taught when I was in school, and a lot of the women that I've come across over the years, a lot of us are taught that we can get pregnant on any day of our cycle, that there's no safe time. And that leads a lot of us to be really fearful. So then we end up taking birth control for years and years and years because we feel like that's the only way. But it's interesting because the biology doesn't match what we're being taught.
No. Does it relate to about a 9-day cycle? So after your menstruation, there's a 9-day party period, then there's a 9-day period where you can become pregnant. That's the understanding of many people, including myself. Is that very much flawed?
Yes, I would say that. I don't really mince words, but I would say that because one of the challenges, so in my field, is that a lot of people equate fertility awareness with, say, the rhythm method.
Yes.
So a lot of us are familiar with the idea that, so what the rhythm method is it's basically like a calendar calculation type of method. And
Right.
so the idea behind it is, okay, if we track your cycles for a couple of times, let's say we track 3, 4, 6 cycles, then we can get an average of when you usually ovulate, and then we can kind of base, we can guess when you're going to ovulate based on those calculations. So that's a lot of the time when we think about the menstrual cycle, we think about, okay, the cycle's 28 days, ovulation happens on day 14, and it's always going to be the same.
Okay.
But when you look at an actual woman, a human being, and you track her actual cycles, what you find is that the cycle is variable. And so if we break the cycle down, we have the periods. We have menstruation, which typically lasts anywhere from 3 to 7 days in a healthy cycle. Yes. And then we enter into the pre-ovulatory phase. So the pre-ovulatory phase is the most variable part of the cycle because it's the most susceptible to stress and to different types of, so for instance, if you do experience a lot of stress or something's happening, then that can really delay the cycle. Okay. So then, ovulation happens. So we produce cervical mucus for several days as we approach ovulation. And then after ovulation, the second half of the cycle is more stable, and it typically is between about 12 to 14 days. So contrary to the myth that a woman's cycle is always 28 days, a healthy cycle can range anywhere from, say, 24 to 35 days.
Gosh.
And so that would mean in a healthy cycle then with that range, ovulation could occur, say, as early as day 10 or as late as day 22 or day 23, for example.
Wow.
And so with that in mind, the way that fertility awareness is different to the rhythm method is that fertility awareness is not about calendar calculation. So in a sense, it doesn't really matter what happened last cycle, because what we're going to do is we're going to check your signs every day. We're going to check for mucus every day. We're going to check your temperature every day. And then at the end of each day, we're going to say, am I fertile or not, based on what I saw or didn't see. And so with that, that's why, so with the fertility awareness method, when used correctly, so I teach my clients the symptothermal method. And so that sympto means that you're, mixing the symptoms like the cervical fluid and the cervical position with the thermal, like the temperature. Right. And so when you take those signs together from a scientific standpoint, when used correctly, the method has been shown to be up to 99.4% effective in preventing pregnancy, because you're not guessing, you're not like looking at a calendar, you're actually looking at your body.
Yes.
And you understand the science of it, and when you receive instruction in a specific method of charting, then you can really get that high effectiveness because you know what you're doing.
Right. Now, one of your signs I understand basal temperature and also the fluid, but what about the cervical position?
Mm-hmm.
How can you tell what position is the cervix is in, if it's smiling or not?
I like how you put that. Well, so what's interesting, I think, first of all, to kind of understand is that all of the different signs that we pay attention to, they're affected by our hormones. So as we approach ovulation, we're making increasing levels of estrogen. Eventually the estrogen peaks, and that's what triggers ovulation. So for instance, when you're watching for cervical fluid, as you approach ovulation, you're producing more estrogen. The cervical fluid that you see, the clear, stretchy, or the lotiony, that's because of the higher levels of estrogen stimulating the cervix to make to produce the cervical mucus.
Okay.
And so in the same way then, as you approach ovulation, the estrogen triggers changes in the cervix itself.
Yes.
So what happens is the cervix becomes softer, and the cervix and actually the whole uterus changes position. So typically as you approach ovulation, the cervix actually rises. So for a woman so not all women are comfortable, first of all, checking their cervix. But for women who are, you would insert your middle finger, because it's the longest one, into your vagina, and you would check the position of the cervix each day. So you kind of like palpate it. So outside of the fertile window, it's kind of firm. It feels like the end of your nose.
Okay.
And it feels closed. So you don't really feel much of an opening, so to speak. And then as you approach ovulation, the cervix rises position. So with my clients, I always use my hand. So if this was your uterus, this would be the cervix. So it actually rises inside the vagina. So you'd have to put your finger in a little bit more, like further to find it. Softer, more like the texture of your lips. And you may feel a bit of a dimple because it's actually open during that time to allow the sperm to pass through. So you can, it's a fascinating thing for women to discover this about their bodies, because once you start charting, your cervix is like a woman's cervix is just cyclically doing these things. But when you start paying attention, then you can kind of see these differences, and they're cyclical. So your cervix does this every cycle. Every time you ovulate, it changes around that fertile time. And then after ovulation, what happens is your ovaries produce a significant amount of progesterone. The only time we really produce a significant amount of progesterone is after ovulation. And then that progesterone shuts down our mucus production, and it changes the position of the cervix back to the low, firm, and closed.
There's a lot that happens underneath a bonnet, isn't there?
Right? Women are fascinating. Like, our bodies are incredible.
Wow. It is incredible. Always in a state of flux.
Well, and the temperature, I'll briefly mention as well, because I know you mentioned the temperature. So what we're measuring when we're taking the BBT, the basal body temperature, is our resting metabolism.
Right.
And so essentially what you're doing, if you go to sleep and your body achieves that state of rest after at least 5 hours of sleep. So first thing in the morning before you get out of bed, you take your temperature, and it's a measure of your metabolism. And so all of these changes are affected by hormones, as I mentioned. So after ovulation, we're producing significant amounts of progesterone, and the progesterone has a thermogenic effect on the body. So it actually, when you plot it on the graph, so when you take your temperature, you're taking it in like to the 10th of a degree. And so then you can actually see a shift on the graph, whether you're doing it on paper or on an app or something. And you can, draw a line between the temperatures before and after ovulation. It's an obvious, clear shift that happens. And I know for myself, so when, back to my post-high school feminist phase, and I was learning about charting, I've always been a bit of a science nerd. And it was just so fascinating to me to see this cyclical change. I could actually put it on a graph, and I could identify every cycle when I would ovulate. And then when I was paying attention, my cervical mucus would change, my cervical position would change, my temperature would change. Now it's been almost 20 years, so I have all this data, if you will. But it's fascinating because you can do this at home. I mean, the second best way to check when you ovulate would be to have like a daily ultrasound, but I don't know anyone that has one of those in their house. So it's really empowering to be able to get this knowledge and information just by simple tracking.
Right. Now, infertility, it seems to be more predominant now. More people are having difficulty having children. Why is that?
Well, isn't that the $30 million question? There's a lot of factors. I would say that a good place to start would be, okay, what is the recipe for pregnancy. What is the recipe for a successful fertilization, implantation, healthy pregnancy? And so you need, healthy sperm, healthy eggs. You need to have a healthy body on both sides. You need to have healthy cervical fluid because that's what keeps the sperm alive. So just in the very kind of basic sense, there's a lot of things that are different now. So some of the things that are different now, women are having children a lot later on average. So, women are now starting their families in their mid-30s and late 30s, so that plays a role. One of the things that I talk about in the book, and I often find myself talking about with clients and on the podcast, and basically anytime I have an opportunity, is the declining sperm count and declining sperm quality. That's something I'm not sure that most people realize, that when you have a couple that is dealing with fertility challenges, that 40 to 50% of the time it's related to male factor infertility. And so when you take a look at the historical data, the average man in the 1940s had a sperm concentration of about 113 million sperm, based on one of the studies I was looking at. And your average man today has an average sperm concentration of anywhere from 40 to 50 million sperm per milliliter.
That's plummeted down.
Yeah, that's like a 60 to 70% decline in the count of sperm. And so that's a big factor, because the reason why I kind of lead with that is that when you have a couple that's struggling to conceive, it's typically the woman who thinks that it's all me, it must have been because I ate those, whatever. But as women, we tend, because we're the ones that carry the baby, especially when we start tracking our cycles, we kind of assume that it has to be completely 100% us, because we all assume that it's the male part is completely fine. So I think it's really important to mention, and I've seen that a lot. I've seen, so for instance, we could, if you want to get into sperm a bit more, we could talk a bit more about it. But because the sperm count and quality has been declining, what has really changed is we've just continued to lower the bar. So what we used to consider normal, we just keep lowering it and lowering it. So now where it's at with, so for instance, the World Health Organization released a document in 2010. They may have released an updated version by now, but there's specific parameters that are listed for sperm quality, and they're very low. So now, if you have a sperm concentration of 15 million sperm and above, 50 million sperm per milliliter and above, that's considered to be normal. If the morphology is 4% or more, that's normal. 4% morphology means that out of every 100 sperm, 4 are normal. Meaning, so abnormal sperm means 2 heads, no head, 2 tails, just malformed, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at the pictures, they don't look like what we think of. So so that's all. I can kind of put a pin in that, but that's a factor that we have to consider.
Just so I can understand, you're saying out of 100 sperm, 4 are abnormal or 4 are normal?
4 are normal. So 96, the 2 heads, no head, no tail, misshapen head. So when you look at the World Health Organization, the kind of lower minimum for what is considered to be normal. And when you look at, lab results, what they'll show is normal is considered 4% morphology or higher. So 96 out of every 100 are incapable of fertilizing anything because they have serious malformations, and 4 are normal. And so we can't understate.
You wrong. Is it
no. But then when you look at what the research has to say, ideal sperm morphology and motility, so one of the 3 kind of main, they look at morphology, motility, and the concentration. So optimal for natural conception at home is more 40 to 50 million sperm per milliliter concentration minimum, 15% morphology. I think for men, one of the things I often say to my clients for us to get our head around this is that even the healthiest man alive, the majority of his sperm are not normal. So, and what's interesting, we talked a little bit briefly about cervical fluid. So it's like Mother Nature knew that the majority of the sperm that men produce are not capable of fertilizing anything. So within our cervical mucus, there's actually a filtration system. We produce different types of mucus. Our cervix has these different folds and called the cervical crypts, and there's different crypts that produce different types of mucus. And so, for instance, like if I'm in my fertile window and I'm having sex with my partner or something like that, my cervical mucus actively filters out sperm that are malformed and sperm that have poor motility, leaving only, oh, pardon?
All this knowledge will ruin the moment, wouldn't it?
I mean, it's hard to ask me because I've known this for years. I don't think it does. I think that it can help us to appreciate it more.
Yeah.
And I just think that, so for instance, when we think about fertility and the role of sperm, the role of sperm is often overstated. So it's kind of like we often think of the sperm as the valiant warriors swimming to, they're just so, but when you look at what happens, like from a scientific standpoint, cervical mucus is amazing. So like I said, I have a whole chapter about it, so I don't necessarily, like if you want, it's all about how far do you want to take this, right? But so there's a few really interesting things about cervical mucus. So one of them is that cervical mucus rapidly draws the sperm into the cervical crypt. So if you look at it under a microscope, it has these channels that rapidly transport sperm. So our mucus is like doing a lot of work getting the sperm in to where it needs to go really quickly.
Wow.
And then once the sperm get in there, our uterus we have these smooth muscle contractions. So the sperm are like, they're valiant and they're swimming, but as a woman, our bodies are actually actively drawing the sperm up to where it needs to go. And so from ejaculation, when you look at, again, I'm a big nerd, so I took a lot of time reading the research, but sperm has been found in the fallopian tubes as quickly as 5 to 10 minutes after, insemination.
Wow.
Yeah. So our bodies do a lot of the heavy lifting. So it's helpful to know that. I feel like it's nice and important to know that. Yeah.
Wow. So why do you think, this is back to the $50 million question again, why do you think the fertility, the sperm rate count has gone down so much over the recent years?
I mean, I think there's a lot of different factors. We can't discount the impact of pollution and the environmental factors. I mean, if you even look in nature, there's a lot of different signs of how pollution affects. So for instance, the, billions of tons of chemicals in the air and the water. We know that a lot of chemicals have a structure that's similar to our hormones. So a lot of these chemicals are characterized as endocrine disruptors or as xenoestrogens because they are synthetic chemicals that are similar enough in structure to estrogen that they kind of stimulate our estrogen receptors.
Right.
So as a man, men produce 10 times the testosterone that women do. And exposing men to a lot of estrogenic chemicals can reduce their testosterone levels and have a disruptive impact on their endocrine systems. So, if you think about the impact of all of that, and then all the chemicals that we use, so beyond the environment, all the different chemicals that we use can have a disruptive effect on the endocrine system. The types of foods that we're eating or not eating. So in industrialized nations, we've kind of moved away from a lot of ancestral, high quality, nutrient dense foods in favor of processed foods and junk foods and all those types of things. And what's interesting is when you look at traditional cultures, many traditional cultures had a sense that when you were trying to conceive, you should take a period of time to, eat certain foods and just have a general kind of preparation, preparing your body for pregnancy. But our culture largely lacks that beyond go off the pill and take a prenatal, let alone the thought that maybe men should be doing that too. So so a lot of lifestyle factors, when we look at what can impact sperm quality negatively, and it's very similar to what can impact egg quality negatively. So the research is very much parallel. But for instance, like drinking and smoking, Marijuana was just legalized in Canada. So cigarettes and or marijuana, like all the smoking. But, all of those types of things. There's a lot of research that shows that alcohol consumption, cigarette smoking, marijuana smoking can have a negative impact on sperm quality.
Okay.
Junk food, eating a lot of sugar, even over exercising, like exercising too much, like 5, 6, 7 times a week. And then if the testicles are too hot on a regular basis, so there is some credence to like, are you in the hot tub all the time, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of different factors that can have a negative impact on sperm. But the good thing about the sperm conversation is that when you address those factors and also focus on specific nutrients that we know support sperm production and sperm quality, you can actually do a lot to improve it. So there's good news there. It's like good news and bad news. It's a sandwich.
The estrogen, are they in the soy milk and in plastics that people are using? Plastic water containers, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, BP, we could go down the list, like BPA, the plastic containers.
Yes.
There's the chemicals in the the non-stick pans and things like that. The perfluorinated chemicals. And even soy. You mentioned soy. So soy specifically is estrogenic. It's a plant-based estrogen, so it's not the same as a chemical estrogen.
Okay.
But excessive soy consumption has been shown to disrupt the menstrual cycle, tends to lengthen the follicular phase, so delay ovulation.
Yes.
And excessive soy consumption has also been shown to interfere with testosterone levels and sperm production. And then the EMF radiation, so for men who have their cell phone in their pocket all the time or have their laptop on their lap when they're working, that's been shown to decrease. So there's a lot of, it's helpful to kind of first start with the lifestyle factors that can negatively impact.
Yes, and if you know what these negative lifestyle things are, you can change them, I guess. Get glass containers for cooking or for eating, and there's a lot of things you can do. Non-stick pans, that's one that's new to me. I didn't know that contained nasty.
Well, yeah, the non-stick pans, it's interesting. So they off-gas PFCs, which are known environmental pollutants. And it's just, there's a number of chemicals that have been shown to be disruptive of the endocrine system. And it's one of the hardest conversations that I often have because it can be so overwhelming. So I think it's equally an issue for men, but for women, all of the beauty products, all of the cleaning products, unless you're specifically looking for natural type products, they all contain these disruptive chemicals. So for instance, if you think about like hand lotions and just the basic stuff, shampoo, conditioner, deodorant, they all contain fragrance, parabens, like all these different chemicals, because that's just how they're made. So when you first discover this, so for a lot of women, perhaps they start charting their cycles and they start to notice this connection, and they might start switching out some of their products. Menstrual products are another. If you're using regular pads and tampons from the store that are not organic, they bleach those. They have menstrual products, tampons, pads have been found to contain dioxins.
Wow.
And so you're putting those in your vagina, which is obviously similar to putting things in your mouth, so it's very absorbent. So for some women, they discover this, they start using natural beauty products, or maybe they start making their own lotion, or they'll start using different types of menstrual products that don't contain these chemicals. And some women will find that some of their symptoms, if they had hard periods, really painful or heavy, or maybe they had some PMS symptoms, some women find that some of those symptoms lessen just by reducing their exposure to these chemicals, because these chemicals can disrupt the endocrine system and change our hormonal profile and things like that.
Right.
Yeah. So, and then obviously for the men, it can disrupt their testosterone production. So when you're exposing yourself to chemical estrogens all the time.
Yes. Well, it's countering testosterone, isn't it?
And we should probably mention the most potent xenoestrogen. So the most potent endocrine disrupting chemical, which would be the birth control pill. So you had asked about some of the different challenges,
Yes.
why is it that couples are facing fertility
Yes.
challenges? So there's no research to show that the pill causes any kind of issues permanently for fertility. But what we do know about hormonal birth control is it causes a temporary delay in the return of natural fertility. So for instance, if a woman is on the pill, if she's taken it long term, so in the research, long term is defined as 2 years or more. And a lot of women are taking it 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, even 20 years. And so what happens is when you come off the pill, it typically takes some time before the cycles normalize. And so on average, it can take anywhere from 9 to 12 cycles before the cycles go back to normal. So that's 9 to 12 cycles. Yeah, it's not like because cycles doesn't mean years. Some women come off the pill and they get their period right away. Some women, it takes a couple of months. So 9 to 12 cycles is more like 12 to 18 months. So one of the challenges, so I think of it from a woman's perspective. So let's say that I've been very responsible. I went on the pill, as soon as I was sexually active, and I stayed on it throughout my 20s and possibly 30s. And I finally got it all together. I've got my career, I've got the partner, we're ready to have family. So often, we're kind of counseled by our doctors to wait, like don't go off of it until you're ready to have a family. So I go off of it and I'm ready to have a family now. And I mean now. So then the first cycle that you try, you're kind of cool. You're like, okay, that's okay. And also what I like to say is that as women, we're taught that we can get pregnant every day of our cycle and that basically pregnancy is a given. So you spend a lot of your younger years like deathly afraid of an unplanned pregnancy because you're so scared that it's going to happen. So it doesn't occur to you that things might change in your late 20s and early 30s, or that the pill might suppress your fertility for a period of time. Like it doesn't really occur to us because we're not taught that.
Yes.
So by the second cycle, we're already starting to be concerned. And so, 6 months in, a year in, we're already at the fertility clinic. We're already getting, IUIs and considering IVF. And when you look at what the research has to say is that it's around that time, that year mark, that 18 months post-pill, that your body is finally starting to normalize. So I would say that it's an interesting factor that can be contributing to it, only because we just don't have the knowledge. If we had the knowledge, we could be modifying our use of birth control so that when we know that we're wanting to have babies in the next couple of years, we can start coming off of it and just letting our bodies normalize.
Right. Well, that makes sense. Now you just quickly mentioned artificial insemination like IVF. Can you explain the process to us, please?
Well, I'll say that it's not my area of specialization, first of all. There's different types of artificial reproductive technologies. So there's intrauterine insemination, IUI, where they will, take the sperm, wash it, basically isolate the sperm that they determine to be of better quality, and inseminate it directly into the uterus. So bypassing the cervix and the cervical mucus that we talked about. And one of the challenges in our current kind of state of affairs with regards to fertility and artificial reproductive technology is that part of the reason that I mentioned the World Health Organization has such a low kind of bar for sperm quality is because when the sperm is really low, the solution to male factor infertility, I'm not sure if you're aware, but the current solution is IVF. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. So it's like, instead of trying to address the male factor, the solution to when a man's sperm is the quality is too low, they just do IVF. So with in vitro fertilization, then, there's different ways to do it. Sometimes they'll, match the sperm with the egg and have the sperm kind of self-select and, penetrate the egg. Sometimes they'll do ICSI where they put the sperm in the egg. They choose the sperm and put it in the egg. But basically it involves fertilizing the egg, making embryos, and then putting them in the uterus and seeing if they stick. That's a very non-scientific, basic way of explaining it for any doctors who are listening and are just like, what did she just say? But that's the gist of it, right? Okay.
Now they make several embryos, you said. What happens if say 5 embryos develop? Do they put the other embryos on hold and just implant one embryo back into the uterus?
Well, so that, I mean, that really depends on where you're doing it, the clinic and all those types of things.
Okay.
To kind of dial it a step back, how many embryos that you make successfully also depends on how many eggs are retrieved. And
Right.
so the process itself, I mean, they're using drugs and hormones to create a cycle. So they give you drugs to make it so that when you're developing follicles, you develop multiple follicles so that they can take multiple eggs. So there's a lot of different factors that would contribute to how successful it could be. The factor that has the strongest kind of, how do I say this? When you're looking to anticipate the success of IVF, one of the strongest factors that is correlated with the success of IVF is the age of the woman.
Yes.
So the younger she is, the more likely that they are to get multiple eggs and for the procedures to be successful. The older that she is, the less likely. So I think one of the myths about IVF is that it doesn't really matter what you do, IVF will always save the day. But the chances of IVF being successful for a woman who is in her late 30s and early 40s, it's not the same. And I think we see a lot of images in the media of celebrities getting pregnant. In my book, I gave the example of Janet Jackson because she was famously pregnant at 50. And so it gives us the thought that, oh, I can do that too, and I can get IVF, but we just don't know. The chances of a woman at 50 becoming pregnant with IVF from her own eggs, from the scientific research perspective, are zero. When I was looking at research studies, women over 45 or 46, there were no cases of IVF successfully working. So when we see some of those images in the media, we don't know if perhaps they had frozen their eggs when they were younger so that they were that they were using their younger eggs. We don't know if they used donor eggs, so eggs from a younger woman, implanted with the sperm and then used. So that's just something to point out because I think it's a big myth that IVF will work at any age and it can solve fertility problems for everybody, but it doesn't really work like that.
Why does your ability to become pregnant reduce as you get older? What are the physiological changes that take place? Like you said about eggs, is it the quality of egg that declines?
Well, yeah, I mean, as we get older, it's well documented that egg quality declines with age, okay. And the instance of chromosomal abnormalities increase. We're more susceptible to oxidative stress and damage. So for that to interfere with DNA replication. One of the things that I found when I was looking at the way that age impacts fertility was the rate of miscarriage, which of course would have to do with the quality of eggs. Let me see if I have the stats so that I can say them off the top of my head, but maybe I can find the more specific stats. I think it's here. So there was one Danish study where they examined the pregnancy outcomes of over 600,000 women. So it was a really interesting study, and they had a lot of interesting data points. So overall, the total miscarriage rate was 13.5%, but when they broke it down by age, women who were in their early 20s, the miscarriage rate was closer to about 9%. Whereas by the time that a woman was in her 40s, so say between the ages of like 40 and 42, the miscarriage rate was about 50%.
Gosh.
And by the time that a woman reaches age 45 or older, the miscarriage rate is about 75%. So by the time you hit 40, it's like 1 out of every 2 pregnancies results in miscarriage. And by the time you hit 45 and above, it's like you have to get pregnant 4 times to keep one. Yes. So when I share this with women, with my clients in general, and talk about this, it's something that we don't really know. As a woman, like I've had a miscarriage, and it's like until you have a miscarriage, you don't realize how many other people have miscarriages. Because then all of a sudden you say, oh yeah, I had a miscarriage, and like 6 women come out the woodwork and be like, me too, me too, me too. So we don't really realize how common that it is and how much more it happens as we get older. And of course that's to do with egg quality and also sperm quality, because I think, again, we don't really think of, like we think of men, because men are fertile all the time. Men are the ones that have the sperm all the time. Like you produce sperm every day, and although men do go through their own andropause, men obviously do continue to produce sperm. However, the sperm that an 80-year-old man is producing is not the same as the sperm of a 20-year-old man. We somehow don't equate that. So I think there's multiple factors, but and again, like there are things that you can do to improve egg quality, to reduce oxidative stress, to really focus on that.
Yes.
But there's a limit to what we can do, because there is, with women, there's a hard stop to us being able to reproduce. Like, you know, the fertility very clearly does decline with age.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Wow. I was so busy listening.
What do I ask next? I know.
Yeah. So if you're having difficulty becoming pregnant, what kind of foods would you have to increase chances?
I mean, that's a good question. I would say, when I hear if you're having difficulty becoming pregnant, there's so many things that just in general. So I would say you want to just look at a couple different things. Like, have you come off the pill recently? Like, has your body had the time to transition? I suppose I would, like, because of it's my area, like, of expertise in my field, I would want to know if she's charting, if she's looking at her menstrual cycle. So one of the great things about charting, so my book is called The Fifth Vital Sign, because I'm arguing that the menstrual cycle is like a vital sign that we can pay attention to. And if there's something off in the menstrual cycle, then it can give us information about what could be happening health-wise and give us clues as to where we should look. So I would want to know what her cycle is like, if she's ovulating regularly, if her periods are normal, you know, if generally her cycle is normal. So in a normal cycle, you have a period, it has a beginning, middle, and an end, and then it's over. You don't have excessive pain. Excessive pain with menstruation is very common. A lot of women do experience pain, but it's not normal.
Okay.
Outside of the uterus, instances of pain are considered a problem. Somehow in our culture, it's just like, pain in the uterus is totally fine, but it's a sign of inflammation and potentially a more serious problem like endometriosis. So I think, look at that. Is her period normal?
Yes.
Is she ovulating? Does she produce sufficient cervical mucus? When after ovulation, is the second half of her cycle long enough? You know, is it about 2 weeks? It's supposed to be about 12 to 14 days. Has her partner been tested? Has his sperm been tested? Have you looked at the results? So we talked a little bit about that. I haven't seen it very much when I'm working with women that if they're struggling to conceive that their partner's sperm is perfect. Okay. More often than not, the sperm is much less than ideal. So before I even talk about like what she should be eating, like these are all the things that it's like, you know, is her thyroid functioning normally? Yes. Is she overall healthy? You know, like all the lifestyle pieces. So once you've kind of gone there, of course, there's specific foods that you can eat to improve fertility. And so I come from more of an ancestral perspective, because it's interesting. You can learn a lot from the combination of ancestral practices and also modern science to kind of see why these practices work. So understanding what is important for fertility, one of my top food recommendations for women who are wanting to conceive and prepare for pregnancy and support their hormonal health is liver and organ meats, which might seem a little strange. But liver is in many ways nature's multivitamin.
Yes.
In order to have healthy eggs, a healthy reproductive system, in order for men to make healthy sperm, we need vitamin A, preformed vitamin A, retinol, which is different than the vitamin A, the beta carotene that's found in carrots. So the preformed retinol is in foods, and the most reliable source is liver. And you can also obtain vitamin A through cod liver oil. But liver is not a vitamin A supplement. It's a source of vitamin B12, folate, choline, zinc, iron. It really goes on and on and on. Okay. So for a woman who's trying to conceive, it's not something, it depends on where you live in the world and what your culture is and all that. A lot of us don't necessarily consume it regularly anymore. But it is an important source of nutrition to consider adding in when you are, especially if you've been struggling to conceive. As well, you know, fish, so sources of fish oil, so fish, seafood, for the omega-3 fatty acids, the DHA. And so we we're talking a little bit about egg quality. So vitamin A is essential for egg quality, the antioxidants, selenium, but also, and CoQ10 is well known to be supporting egg quality and sperm quality.
Okay.
And the highest natural source of that is actually liver and heart meat, which is interesting. So I mean, I could go on a little bit more, but would you like me to keep going on the fertility foods?
And all of your healthy foods come from animals. There's a lot of vegetarians that'll be listening and thinking, "Golly, what can I do? I'm just left all alone." Are there any foods that vegetarians can have that are also going to help them?
Well, I mean, I suppose it would depend on what types of foods that they include. So some vegetarians may eat eggs, and so eggs are a good source of choline and folate. And if they do consume, say, dairy products like butter, and so part of the reason that I talk about these foods, it's based on what it's based on what like the research tells us that we need to make healthy sperm and eggs and healthy hormones. So for instance, for a woman who is struggling to get pregnant,
yes,
then we have to look at all these different factors, and we can look at the menstrual cycle. So in order to make your estrogen and progesterone in sufficient quantities, all of these steroid hormones like estrogen and progesterone are made from cholesterol. That's how our body makes them. So if you have a woman who's struggling to produce enough of these hormones, then at some point you'd have to ask, is she consuming any animal fat? And so it's a difficult conversation to have. So I would suppose it would just depend if you're able to add in some of those foods, because again, like if you're talking about just like a woman who's actually struggling to conceive and she's kind of doing everything, then in that situation, I think it's helpful to look at some of these things. If she's not and she's completely fine, then you know what I'm saying? It's a kind of a different conversation.
Right. Okay, well, you've talked about the changes.
So of course, oh no, go ahead.
No, I was interrupting you. Please continue.
No, it's okay. I kind of lost my train of thought.
We can always bounce back. You talked about the changes that take place during each menstrual cycle. What changes take place when there's a successful fertilization of an egg?
Well, that's a good question. So in the menstrual cycle, as I mentioned, as you approach ovulation, you're making significant amounts of estrogen. Eventually the estrogen, rises to a certain level that it triggers your pituitary to release the luteinizing hormone, which is what, if women are listening and they've been trying to conceive, if you take an ovulation predictor kit, it's testing for the LH surge, the luteinizing hormone. And then that's what triggers the ovaries to release the egg. So then after ovulation, you make progesterone. So what happens then in the second half of the cycle is if an egg is fertilized, so that would mean that, you had sex in the fertile window, your cervical mucus kept the sperm alive, and so the sperm was actually already waiting in the fallopian tubes when you ovulated. Right. Fertilization then happens in the fallopian tube, and it takes about a week or so for the egg to kind of make its way into the uterus. Yeah. So then fertilization would start about, say, a week or so, 6 to 7 days after ovulation had occurred.
Yes.
And your progesterone level, so when you don't get pregnant, the progesterone rises, yes, and then it drops off, and then you get your period, about 12 to 14 days later. But when you conceive, the progesterone rises, but the egg is trying to implant, so the progesterone continues to rise. Yes. And the progesterone is crucial in preparing the uterine lining for fertilization. There's a short window of time where the egg can actually implant into the uterine lining. And so I would say one of the major changes, so if you're charting your cycles and you're monitoring your temperatures, for a lot of women, the first signs of pregnancy are the temperature not going back down. So instead of having your temperature go down like 12 to 14 days and then you get your period, the temperature rises. So some women, it just kind of rises, and others, it actually, like there's like they call it a triphasic shift, but there's like a shift in ovulation, and then for some women, they'll see another shift after they've gotten pregnant. Yes. And then for on a practical level, so when you're charting your cycles, 18 high temperatures is how we would confirm pregnancy without a test. And then also for some women, they might find that their breasts get really tender. And so that's one of the first signs that, I might be pregnant. Okay. That comes before the nausea.
And it's again, I guess, with the hormones rising.
Yeah.
When you listen to all the steps that take place, it's really a miracle. It is, because every chain, every link has got to succeed. Every step has got to be good for it to continue.
It's so true. I mean, when you understand all of these little things that can happen, I mean, first of all, like when you have sex, half the sperm are like in the wrong fallopian tube.
Yeah.
So few of the sperm actually make it up because the mucus is actively filtering out the sperm so the sperm that are abnormally shaped, our mucus has these little loaf-like structures that stick to them and prevent them from going forward, and the ones that can't swim properly, they can't, the mucus is thick enough to make so they can't swim. So quite literally, like the majority of them don't even get a shot. Half of them are in the wrong tube.
Gosh.
And I mean, there's some research that suggests that the egg chooses, so you need multiple sperm to weaken the structure of the egg.
Yes.
So that one of them can be let in, but then the egg kind of chooses the one that gets to. So it is a miracle, really. And then when you read about implantation, I think that's really interesting as well, because I mentioned there's like a small window. The uterine lining is only receptive to the fertilized egg for a very short window of time. So it all has to work out quite well. And then, as we know, I mean, there's also the additional screening tool. A certain percentage of pregnancies end in miscarriage. So everything really does have to align in order for us to be here. So you and we are miracles. Like, how did we even get here?
I know. It is a miracle. Or curse, whichever way you think about it. But with IVF, we've got a human intervention that's bypassing a lot of the safeguards. So if I know we're using microscopes just to observe the quality, but you can't see the DNA composition of the sperm. So how do we know whether a sperm is good and viable?
I've always wondered that. As a fertility awareness educator, especially, I think IUI gets me a little bit more, because I always think to myself, like, so wait a minute, we're bypassing the mucus, like we're going straight to the uterus, like we know more than Mother Nature. But I mean, you can take a look at a sperm under a microscope and identify if it looks normal or not.
Yes.
But of course, there's going to be things that we don't understand about.
Yeah.
Why would if the egg really does choose, why would the egg choose this one versus that one?
Thing, because already they're all strong swimmers. They've bypassed all the mucus linings and all the filters. They've perhaps maybe 10 have made it to the egg. How do people looking through a microscope know which one of those 10 is the right one to use? This is
we don't. Yeah, but I mean, ultimately, there's still additional screening tools, because not all embryos. So when they put together, so as I mentioned, there's different ways to put embryos together. So sometimes they do it where they put the sperm and the egg together and let it happen. So sometimes they do that, and and other times they insert it with a microneedle. I would love to see one of those under the microscope, because that boggles my mind. So the egg is the size of a dot. So if you look in a book or something, like the size of a period, you can. I have not seen an egg with the naked eye, but my understanding is that you can actually see the egg with the naked eye. But the sperm is so tiny, So, but there's additional screening. So when they're doing, I've worked with a lot of clients who've gone through different procedures, and so sometimes they'll retrieve the eggs, they'll add the sperm to it, and none of the embryos will be viable, or few of them will be. So they put them together, but that doesn't mean 100% of those are viable. And then once they have the embryos, I think one of the questions that you asked earlier is like, what do they do with all of them? So I mean, in some cases, I know that they freeze them, and then if you have like a lot of not a lot, but like a lot. Does that make sense? Like a lot of them versus like, anyways, I'm just being silly now. But so they'll, freeze them. And then I interviewed Dr. Marjorie Dixon. She's a local, she lives in, she's a Toronto IVF specialist, reproductive endocrinologist. But she described how IVF works in threes. So what she described was the goal is to, you create a certain number of embryos, and each IVF cycle, she described a full cycle as being like 3. So you take enough embryos that you try once, and if it doesn't work, you try again, and if it doesn't work, you try again, and that's a full cycle.
Okay.
So Mother Nature is still in there. Not all of those embryos survive, and then even if we implant them, not all of them grow into babies. So I think it's a combination then of human intervention and magic.
You can't bypass human nature completely. Now,
No.
Getting close to the end of the summer, I wanted to ask one other question that's come in. It's stretch marks. How can we avoid stretch marks?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. I don't know if you can ever completely avoid stretch marks, but there's a few things that you can do if you understand just, again, physiology, what's happening in pregnancy. So, I mean, one of the nutrients that becomes more crucial, one of the nutrients that we need a lot more of during pregnancy is glycine, the building blocks, collagen and gelatin. What are the building blocks that make our skin? And so if you think about it, the uterus expands in size. I don't know exactly off the top of my head, but the uterus expands several times in size. Obviously, our bodies expand in size, and we're making a tiny human that's made of skin and bones.
Yes.
And connective tissue and ligaments and joints. So one of the things that you can do to at least to minimize, to kind of do what you can, is ensure that you are consuming foods that are rich in collagen and gelatin. So if a person is vegetarian, that's a challenge, because collagen and gelatin, these are primarily coming from animal foods. So if you are not averse to, say, bone broths, doing soups and stews and things like that, that is a good way to incorporate that into your diet, if you're willing to kind of simmer down the joint knuckle bones and things like that, so that you're getting a lot of collagen and gelatin. Or if you're open to, say, if you do smoothies or something like that, your protein source could be like a collagen or a gelatin powder, but just making sure that you're actually getting that. And then when you look at what you require to make tissues and skin, you also require vitamin C to develop your connective tissue. So I would say the best thing that you could do is to try your best to increase your consumption of collagen and gelatin rich foods and ensure that you're having enough vitamin C to develop those tissues.
Okay. Would you not recommend a topical oil or cream?
Well, you can certainly do that. But when you think about what is like, so because I've been pregnant twice, and I have the stretch marks to prove it. And so when you think about what's happening in your body from that kind of biological level, if you're not giving your body the building blocks that it needs to basically double the size of certain work, and to also build the baby itself, then the cream is kind of secondary to the actual fundamental building blocks of your tissues.
Okay, that's so important. Okay, now how do people contact you or learn more?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and for asking such great questions. This has been a lot of fun. So you can find me if you like podcasts. If you listen to podcasts, you can type in Fertility Friday on your favorite podcast, and my name will come up. My website is fertilityfriday.com. And of course, my book is The Fifth Vital Sign, Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. I talked a lot today about the scientific references and, where things are coming from, the information. And so in the book, I cited over 1,000 research citations. My aim was to make it a resource, especially for women who are interested in fertility awareness. There's a lot of skepticism. A lot of people wonder if it works. A lot of people conflate it with the rhythm method. And so I wanted to create something where it's like, okay, if you see something in there and you're not sure, then you can actually go to the back and see where the information is coming from. So The Fifth Vital Sign is available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and audiobook formats. So.
Fantastic. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for coming onto our show. It's been brilliant having you on. You've answered some tough questions, and you've Well, they're very pertinent questions for today as well. I mean, pertinent details. It is true that most couples, I'd say, are having difficulty having children. And you provided some answers. So thank you so much for that. And it's been fantastic having you with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Bye-bye.